The sun had barely risen over the bustling city when Juma stepped out of the family mansion, his school uniform neatly ironed, his shoes polished to a shine that mirrored the kind of upbringing he and his sisters enjoyed. Their father, Chief Oyueme, was a man whose name commanded respect across the borders of Nairobi. He owned thriving companies, fleets of trucks that transported goods across the country, and a portfolio of cities that could rival any top businessman of his generation. Their mother, though quiet and graceful, had always been the pillar that kept their home balanced. She had passed on 5 years earlier, but her absence had only drawn Juma, Joy, and Olive closer to their father. At 17, Juma already carried himself like the man of the house whenever his father was away on business. While Joy, at 16, was quick-witted, outspoken, and often helped Olive with her studies. Olive, the youngest at 10, was gentle, cheerful, and still carried the innocence of childhood that softened even the hardest of hearts. Together, they were bound by love, comfort, and a sense of security that made their lives feel like a golden dream. Their days were filled with laughter, lavish breakfast before school, weekend trips to the beach, and late evenings in the living room where their father told them stories about his struggles and triumphs in business. It was in those moments that Juma began to dream of becoming like his father, a man of dignity, honor, and endless generosity. But beneath the laughter and comfort of their mansion, the shadows lurked. Their father's extended relatives, many of whom had benefited from his wealth at one time or another, grew restless and envious. They envied the comfort of Juma and his sisters, whispering behind closed doors that Chief Oyueme had spoiled his children too much, that they were too young to understand the value of money. The step-cousins who visited during holidays mocked Joy and Olive for being pampered girls who couldn't cook with firewood or fetch water from the stream. While some uncles would often throw sly remarks about how much their father spent on the children's schooling abroad. To the children, these comments meant little. They dismissed them as petty jealousy. To Chief Oyueme, they were nothing but noise, for he believed his hard work was his to share with his children as he pleased. Still, the whispers grew roots, wrapping themselves around the hearts of relatives who had been waiting for an opportunity to take more than what was theirs. Then came the night that shattered everything. Chief Oyueme had returned from a business trip feeling sick. He dismissed it as fatigue, the toll of endless travels and meetings. But within days, his health deteriorated. Juma watched in horror as the strong man who once lifted him effortlessly onto his shoulders now struggled to breathe. Joy and Olive sat by his bedside, their faces streaked with tears as doctors and nurses moved in and out of the mansion, whispering in low tones that carried more fear than hope. The children prayed every night, begging God to spare the only parent they had left. And then, one quiet dawn, as the city of Nairobi was quiet outside, so heavy it suffocated. Chief Oyueme was gone. Juma remembered the cry that tore from his own throat, the way Joy clung to him as though the ground had given way beneath them, and how Olive's sobs echoed through the halls like the sound of a breaking heart. The mansion that had once been filled with laughter now became a tomb of grief. People trooped in with condolences, but even in their mourning clothes, some eyes gleamed with something other than sorrow, something sharp, calculating, and greedy. For the children, those first days after their father's death were a blur of confusion and despair. Friends of the family came and went, offering sympathy, promising support, while the relatives began to circle closer, their words coated with honey, but their intentions dripping with venom. Juma tried to be strong, remembering his father's words about standing tall no matter the storm. But at 17, grief weighed on him like an iron chain. Joy cried herself to sleep every night, and Olive's once bright eyes dimmed with fear of what the future might hold. Yet none of them could have imagined that their worst trials were only beginning. The death of their father was not the end of their pain. It was merely the opening of a door that would unleash betrayal, cruelty, and suffering they had never known before. As the relatives began to make their moves in hushed meetings and secret discussions with the family lawyer, the golden days of Juma, Joy, and Olive were already slipping into the shadows of a storm that would test the very core of their souls. The first few weeks after Chief Oyueme's burial were filled with endless visits, relatives moving in and out of the mansion as though it already belonged to them. At first, Juma thought their presence meant comfort. He believed the family would rally together to protect them, to make sure his sisters never lacked anything. But as the black clothes from mourning began to fade and the visitors dwindled, the truth emerged like a snake from the shadows. One afternoon, the children were called into the large sitting room where their uncles, aunts, and the family lawyer sat in a circle that felt more like a courtroom than a home. Juma sat upright, holding Joy and Olive's hands tightly. The lawyer cleared his throat and with a rehearsed expression of sorrow, announced that Chief Oyueme had died without leaving a will. The word struck Juma like a slap. He knew his father was meticulous, deliberate, always planning for the future. He could not believe that a man who had often lectured him about preparing for tomorrow had failed to secure his children's inheritance. Before he could speak, one of his uncles, a man with eyes like sharpened stones, leaned forward and declared that in the absence of a will, the estate would fall to the elders of the family. Confusion and fear swirled in Joy's eyes while Olive began to sob quietly. Juma, though shaken, tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the chorus of relatives agreeing with one another. Within days, the mansion that had once been their sanctuary became hostile. Ground locks were changed, rooms were stripped, and belongings were moved without consent. The children began to feel like strangers in their own home. Soon the whispers turned into outright insults. They were told they were too young to manage wealth, that their father had spoiled them, that they were cursed. Their relatives, who had once bowed respectfully to their father, now looked at them with cold disdain. The final blow came one rainy evening. Juma and his sisters returned from visiting a neighbor, only to find their clothes and school bags dumped outside the gate. The guards, who had once greeted them with smiles, now refused to let them in. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, some whispering, others shaking their heads in pity, but no one stepped forward to help. Joy clung to Juma, crying uncontrollably, while Olive kept asking, "Where will we go now, brother?" Juma's chest burned with helpless rage, but he swallowed his tears and tried to look strong for them. That night, the siblings sought shelter in the compound of a distant aunt. She listened to their pleas, shook her head, and whispered about how times were hard. She claimed she couldn't take responsibility for them, not with her own children to feed. Another relative slammed the door in their faces, muttering that they should fend for themselves since their father had left them with nothing. Each rejection deepened their wounds. Juma had grown up believing that family was a shield, a safety net. But now, in their darkest hour, those very ties had become chains, dragging them into despair. The siblings wandered the streets of Dandora until exhaustion forced them to curl up under a shade in front of an abandoned kiosk. The cold night air beat at their skin, mosquitoes hummed in their ears, and the concrete floor became their bed. Joy shivered under the thin scarf she used as a blanket, while Olive coughed softly, her body fragile from the shock of their new reality. Juma lay awake, staring into the darkness, guilt gnawing at him. He had promised his father he would take care of his sisters, but how could he protect them now, days blurred into nights? As the children adjusted to their cruel fate, hunger became a constant companion. They scavenged for leftovers, begged for scraps from uncaring strangers, and drank sachets of water to fill their empty stomachs. Joy's once glowing face grew pale, while Olive, the youngest, fell ill frequently, her small frame racked with fever. Juma, though barely holding himself together, forced a brave front. He carried water for traders in the market, running errands in exchange for coins that could barely buy food. As the years passed, Juma's determination grew. He saved tiny amounts from his daily struggles, even if it meant going without food. Every coin tucked away felt like a seed of hope for a future. He was determined to create. Joy, inspired by his resilience, began encouraging Olive to study by candlelight, using old textbooks she picked from the trash. The siblings became known in the market streets, with some pitying them, a few helping with small favors, then most still mocking them. Yet slowly, Juma's savings grew. He worked hard, often going without food himself, just to make sure his sisters' needs were met. One evening, after years of odd jobs, Juma saw an opportunity. A wholesale seller needed someone reliable to help supply sachet water to kiosks and small shops. Juma threw himself into the work, determined to succeed. He rose before dawn, pushed heavy crates of water across town, endured the insults of impatient shopkeepers, and fought exhaustion day after day. Slowly, the coins grew into notes, and from notes into savings, tucked carefully away. Joy and Olive watched with pride as Juma began to change their lives. Not through miracles, but through persistence. When Juma finally saved enough to buy his own small stock of water to resell, the siblings celebrated with the only thing they could afford, laughter. As Juma's business grew, he sent Joy back to school. She had always been sharp, her mind hungry for books even when her stomach was empty. Juma worked harder, often going without food himself, just to make sure her fees were paid. Olive, too, was not forgotten. She had always dreamed of becoming a doctor, inspired by the strangers who had once turned them away. Years slipped by, carrying the children into young adulthood. The scars of the streets did not fade, but they transformed into marks of resilience. Juma, now respected in the market, was no longer seen as a helpless boy, but as a man who had carved his place through sweat and sacrifice. Joy, brilliant and determined, began to excel in her studies. Teachers spoke of her potential, and soon she earned a scholarship that covered her schooling. Olive, though younger, followed closely behind her, compassion shining in every assignment she touched. The world that had once mocked them began to take notice. Their relatives, who had once jeered at them, now greeted Juma with respect. Neighbors whispered about the siblings who had refused to die in the gutter. And though their relatives had long forgotten them, the seeds of justice were already sprouting in silence. The day of reckoning came when Juma returned from a business trip to find Joy waiting for him in the family mansion they now owned. She looked unsettled. "They came today," she said softly. "Our relatives." Juma frowned. "Who?" "Our relatives," Olive replied, her voice carrying both anger and sorrow. "They came here not with arrogance like before. This time, they came crawling." The once proud relatives knelt before them, their clothes torn, their eyes hollow, their bodies frail. They wept, begging for forgiveness, their voices trembling with desperation. Juma's chest heaved as he looked at them, but Joy placed a hand on his arm. "We are not them, Juma. We are not like them." The court proceedings that followed exposed the relatives' betrayal, and the truth came out in full light. The once respected relatives were disgraced publicly, their names dragged through the mud, their crimes exposed. The family lawyer who had connived with them was arrested, and what little remained of their stolen wealth was seized. Juma, Joy, and Olive stood tall in that courtroom, no longer the helpless orphans of yesterday, but the conquerors of today. The world applauded, justice thundered, and history was written. Their rise was complete, their enemies' fall absolute. As they left the courtroom, the siblings were met with cheers. Strangers embraced them, tears streaming down faces. Some shouted, "God bless you, Juma." Others cried, "Joy, you are a lioness." People knelt just to touch their hands, the hands that now saved lives. The siblings who had once been cast away were now celebrated as heroes, not just for their success, but for their resilience, their faith, and their refusal to give up. Their story spread like wildfire across the nation, becoming a beacon of hope for others who had been betrayed, abandoned, or oppressed. And so, the story of Juma, Joy, and Olive came full circle, a testament to the power of love, resilience, and determination. They had risen above their past, and their future was brighter than ever.